Welcome back to the Novelty Podcast. My name is Alexandra.
I'm Emily.
And I like to read from the perspective of what does the reader owe the book.
And I like to read from the perspective of what does the writer owe their readers.
And since it's the Novelty Podcast, let's start off with the tea because the novel is going to be spicy. Actually, the tea's a little spicy.
It's a little spicy today too. We are drinking Harney and Sons Halloween Party. They have an entire Agatha Christie collection of tea. And every year for Christmas, my husband gets me the new collection because he knows I like Agatha Christie and tea. And this was their new flavor for the year.
I actually just read that in October last year. And I love how British it is. They're like, we don't really do that here. The Americans do, but fun.
Which, if in case you've seen this come up in the thing, the movie Haunting in Venice came out. And that was some really stupid movie producer's idea of remaking a Halloween Party. And it just, to me, is so enraging because Halloween Party's entire scariness comes from it taking place in this really small English village in which everybody knows everybody else, and to think of the idea that there's a child killer amongst us, terrifying.
Yeah.
Putting it in Venice and being like there's a ghost, what? No.
I watched the intro to that movie, but I didn't finish. I got about 15 to 20 minutes in, and I was like, oh no. And this was before I had read the book too.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it's just a lack of understanding about what actually is scary.
Right.
So we'll just do a little knockdown right there to start off because this is the kind of podcast we're doing today.
Right. It's only going to go down from here, folks. So today, Emily, so what happened is I pretty much picked the worst time ever to torture my dear friend.
And we're down for it. I walked into torture with my eyes open.
Yeah, and we decided to read A Court of Thorns and Roses in anticipation of analyzing it for this episode.
Because this is such a huge book in culture right now and has been sustained for quite some time.
Yeah. I would say that it is certainly as much as a phenomenon, maybe not quite as much as Twilight, because obviously Twilight got the films, although I think Acotar is about to get optioned. I don't know if it's for a TV series or for a movie yet, but I've heard rumblings about that, so I'm sure it will. But it is in that category, especially as the group of books, definitely at least as popular as that, if not more so.
Right. It's become kind of just a part of this time era.
Right. And the other thing that's interesting about it, I think, is how sustained it's been.
Right.
Both Twilight and Harry Potter kind of were a flash in the pan. The years that those books came out, they really, really sold. Everyone was reading them. Everyone was talking about them. And I don't know if it's because of where it landed on the internet, but I first heard of Acotar during BookTube. Now we've had this resurgence during Book Talk. So it's definitely had this sustained kind of influence. There's a couple of things that I want to kind of check off the list that we talk about right off the top. Then we're going to get into some details about the book. And first, we do want to put a trigger warning at the top of this episode.
Yes, we are going to be talking about some adult subjects because the book has adult subjects in it. We don't plan on getting graphic, but we do want to just put that out there that adult content warning.
Yeah, so if you have little ears, this is not the episode to listen in the van while you're driving family members around, or the SUV, as may be.
Yeah. Also, the book specifically goes into discussions of sexual violence. So if that is triggering for you, just be aware. We are going to discuss those.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one thing that I did want to put up top too, we will be talking primarily around the issues that we see affecting women because we're women in this book. So there's a lot of sort of politics around the women in this book. But I do want to address some issues around racism up at the top, and also kind of my personal philosophy around criticizing books. It's not often that, I'll give my review of the book. I'll tell you what I think, whether I liked it or not, how many stars I would give it, that sort of thing. But I don't often make content on my channel where I am just here to trash a book from beginning to end. That's not usually the content that I'm making. I might have books that I have some criticisms for, or some books that I really, really love, and blah, blah, blah. But for this book, I think it's important to take into consideration that there are some questionable choices that Sarah J. Maas as a person has taken to promote her books.
Right.
Particularly the incident with Breonna Taylor. The post is still up. You can Google it. In fact, I did in preparation for this. But she did tie marketing of one of her book covers in this series to that incident and say oh, well, if you want to support, basically and I don't want to misquote it. So I'll just pause there because I don't have the words in front of me. But she did reference Breonna Taylor and then turn around and make it a moment for her to be like, but look at how cool the cover for my next book looks.
Yeah. Yeah. And in case just some of us are like living in, in a hole, you might want to just explain what the Breonna Taylor situation was.
So the Breonna Taylor case was an incident where police had gotten a warrant for the arrest of an individual. They went to the wrong location where Breonna Taylor was sleeping. They entered her home illegally because they didn't have a warrant for that location, and they shot her to death in her bed while she was sleeping, even though she was not at all the person that they were looking for. So from beginning to end, it was nefarious and incompetent police action that was racially charged because Breonna Taylor was a Black woman.
Right. And so she took that moment because it was a very popular moment on the internet.
And it was getting quick on the heels of Black Lives Matter.
Right. It was getting a lot of hits on the internet because it was such a horrifying story. And she decided to tie her marketing of her book into that, in essence, just to make it like it's going to show up more in the feed because it's doing a hot topic. So
this is that's a pretty egregiously, bad taste doesn't cover that. It's a horrendously distasteful way to promote your own book, is to tie it to a tragedy that is so politically and racially charged in America and was and on the backs of the tragedy of a very real person's death.
Right. So like, I think in part bringing that up when people tend to like make saints out of their favorite authors, and like we need to like be okay with holding people who create work that we like still accountable for their actions. And we have this tendency to feel like if we like someone's work, we also have to really like the creator and everything she does. And so people are not holding creators who do things that are that's just it's wrong. Yeah. So like we need to be, as readers, capable of separating our feelings about a book for our feelings about actions taken by authors, and say, I am not okay with this. This was not a good thing to do. Like this is not something that I support. And there is such a, like, people tie themselves and their personality so into these things that then they get themselves into spaces where like, you can't say anything bad about Sarah J. Maas because I like her books.
Yeah.
And that is not the world we want to live in.
Yeah. Then there's another layer, I think, to the racial conversation that we need to have, which is that the map of Prithian, the fantasy world that we go into, appears to be very much based on a map of Great Britain. And we have coded the evil characters, the barbaric characters, as the Irish versus the British. And if you're familiar with British history at all, the fact that got reversed basically when Britain or the English were the ones who, have attempted over a long period of time to colonize all of the Gaelic peoples, to destroy their language, the potato famine, huge amounts of political conflict to overcome these people and stamp them out from existence in a genocidal way. It's really upsetting to then flip the script and then call the Irish people the barbarians, and to use that kind of dynamic that's really set in place with the racism that already exists there.
There's a very, very deep history there that I feel like people who don't like my family is part British, part Scottish, so like this is we have some internal conflict being both, let's just say that, but like this is a very like dark history that a lot of people just don't know, because you just think of like, all of Great Britain together. I mean, there's a strong need for some people to suggest that like the English, the Scottish, and the Irish are all the same. Don't say that, please.
Yes.
There's a very deep history that she's just using, and it's so uncomfortable. It's like it just does not. I guess it's just like you're just falling into the kind of stereotypes that were written.
It's from the English perspective.
Because don't like the fairies come from like southern England too?
Yes.
Which that's like a classist thing. Traditionally, the English see people who come from southern England as like the high class people, the nobility, the posh people. And like the further north you go, the less value you have.
Right. And it's, So there's that.
one more we're going to get into this.
Right.
We need to be thoughtful about what we're consuming,
right.
you know, and I'm aware that for some reason, like things like what we were talking about with the British and the Irish and the Scottish, or the English, Irish and Scottish, like sometimes we're just like not immediately aware of like those histories and things like that. But I don't think that's an excuse to be like, oh, well, I didn't know. So, you know, it's not that big of a deal. And it's like, well, it is actually a big deal for the people who live in those countries. And to say that like it's not that big of a deal because it's fantasy, or it's not that big of a deal because I didn't know. Like,
or it's not that big of a deal. Please let me read without thinking about politics. Reading shouldn't be political. It's like, well, reading fundamentally is political. You may choose to participate in it or not participate in it. But frankly, that's if you're lucky enough to not have to pay attention to the violence that's going on around the world, then you're a very lucky person.
Well, and also like if you were Irish, it would matter to you. If you were Scottish, it would matter to you. If you're from north of England and you've suffered the indignation, like what the Southern English people do to North English people do, it would matter to you. And just being able to say like, well, it doesn't matter to me because I'm not from those areas. Like you need to really like do a little internal check there. Yeah. Because like, what if they were referencing something that meant something to you? It's like, would you want someone to stand up and say that that's wrong? Well, yeah, you would. You would want other people to say like, oh, I understand what you're feeling. So like I say that's wrong, but you have to do that for other people too.
Right. So all of that to say that for me, when I am looking at this book and when I see the context of what I can know about Sarah J. Maas, I don't know who she is in her private life, but what she's stated publicly and what she's chosen to put in her books, I'm beginning to piece together a holistic political view that I personally strongly disagree with. Now that is to put the racial stuff to one side.
We just felt we needed to like bring that up because I know that is in the discourse, and I don't think that we can just ignore that. Like
it's too important, and these things are intersectional. They comment on each other.
Exactly. It's not necessarily my primary focus of what we're talking about today, but like to ignore those things would be wrong, I think.
Right. And so now we want to kind of get to how this book kind of operates as a romance and some more complicated issues around criticizing romance in general.
Right. Because let me make this clear. I am actually the market for this book. I love romance, and I got really into romance in 2022, and I have read untold amount since then. I read all kinds. I read traditional, I read open door romance, I've read erotica, I've read all of the subgenres from like, fantasy romance to science fiction romance. Like this is in general like my vibe. Like I'm not coming to this as someone who dislikes romance and then is going to criticize it from the perspective, oh, romance is not a good genre.
Yeah.
Entirely not true. I love this genre.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that you and I had discussed, like kind of as we're prepping for this, and you made a really great point, that when people criticize romance, they often criticize it for being too tropey, for being repetitious, for all of these different things. And you rightly pointed out that when you're working within genre fiction, they all have tropes.
All genre fiction relies on tropes. Science fiction, mystery, Western. That is the nature of genre writing.
And what we find is that people are much more willing to criticize the romance genre than any of these other genres.
Exactly.
And I can't help but think that there's a certain amount of misogyny that's tied in with criticizing romance so pointedly.
Oh, absolutely. Like you just need to ask yourself, if you are criticizing romance for using tropes and having things that kind of show up over and over again, but you're not criticizing any of the other genres for the exact same thing, you need to ask yourself why you're more comfortable criticizing a genre that largely belongs to female readers than you are of anything else. Because I can tell you, like, science fiction, which is a very like male-oriented genre in a lot of ways, the level of tropes that they're into is intense, but we don't pick on science fiction for having excessive trope use. And I think there is a level where it comes down to misogyny and feeling much more comfortable criticizing female readers than male readers.
Yeah. And we also, just to put a bow on that point, is like, we're not here to criticize Acotar, to criticize the audience that has enjoyed this book.
No, it's not the...
If anything, this is an invitation for you, if you're a lover of this series, this is an invitation for you to read with us some of the criticisms that we have in this book. We'd like to invite you into this process.
Right.
Rather than, like, I'm not here to make fun of you. You're a romance reader. We're both fantasy readers.
Yeah.
I read my fair share of genre fiction and even fiction that isn't very good. But, and with that, it's important to be able to, even with the things that you enjoy, be able to see its flaws and be able to engage in criticism with it.
Right, because a lot of what we are going to discuss comes down to like how women are treated. And I just would say like this book is written for women and women are the primarily
by a woman
for women. Yeah. And like I feel like as women, when we read books, we should demand to be treated better. Mm-hmm. Like we deserve as readers to be treated better than what happens in this book. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like standing against this book in a lot of ways is standing up for treatment of women.
Yeah. Okay. I think we kind of got our like broad topics
out of the way.
I think, so I'm just going to say up at the front, this is the term that I've used with you. My overall feeling when I kind of finished this book and like stepped away from it is when I felt very manipulated, and I feel like the way that the narrative functions is very manipulative, and then the other kind of thought that I wanted to kind of wrap around this is that this felt like propaganda for making women kind of endorse or feel more comfortable with sexual violence committed against them.
I think that is a very strong theme. I think we wanted to come at this from the perspective of two things. One is the issue of consent, and having a strong discussion about that, because this book has a lot of content that is very questionable when it comes to the concept of consent. So we really need to talk about that. But then I think there's a wider view of like how this book treats women and how like the ideas that it puts forward about what women should and should not be doing.
Absolutely. So, well, then let's go ahead. Let's talk about like the overall role and attitude towards women with some examples of like how the book and the narrative kind of frames Feyre's behavior, what it kind of inculcates in her and trains her to do.
I think the first thing, like we should just start off at the beginning. So the beginning, and for the people out there who haven't read this book, because up until now I hadn't read this book, the whole...
You're welcome.
Yeah. You owe me.
I do.
I'm going to make you read some like super cheesy romance.
Oh
no. The whole story is framed off at the very beginning. Feyre is basically coming from extreme poverty, and she, for some reason, is the only person in her family willing to go out and find food for them. And she happens upon a deer. It is expressed that they are literally going to starve if she doesn't kill this deer.
And in fact, in the most tedious way ever. But it's like the tedious details of when the last time they had bread and like when they and how many days they could live. This scene is so boring, but that's okay.
But it's clearly established.
Yeah.
She either gets this deer or they starve. There, between her and the deer, is a wolf who is also going after the deer. Now, there is some discussion that maybe this wolf might be a fairy, which is weird. But even still, it is also clearly established that humans and fairies are enemies, and that humans should fear fairies and fight them because fairies have a history of enslaving humans.
Right.
So she kills this wolf. Now, if she was a male character, we would treat this, because I've never seen it treated any other way, as like he is taking care of his family, he's ensuring their survival, he's willing to go into these dangerous situations and fight for his family's survival. Instead, and I've seen this trend in books recently, and I'm wondering if this is where it comes from, Feyre is asked increasingly as the story goes on,
more and more
pressure to regret what she did, to apologize what she did. She is repeatedly put down because, it turns out the wolf was a fairy, which again, she doesn't know.
Yeah.
All she knows is this wolf is between her and feeding her family.
So, yeah, and so when we she ends up being taken into the realm of Prythian, and all of these like fairy characters around her are like, how could you?
Yeah.
He was one of our friends. You should feel bad.
You should have known that we would feel this way. It's like, why? Why should she know?
Yeah.
And it's just something that I've seen so frequently done. And it's kind of like this idea of like, showing that she's a woman.
Yeah.
Because as a woman, she can feel their pain and losing their friend, which might be true. But she still, at the end of the day, has the right to say, I needed to surviving.
Doing this to survive. And
I
to
was
protect
surviving.
my family.
Yeah.
And I think, too, it's like this whole narrative kind of puts her in this position where Feyre has to extend herself to them.
Yeah.
She has to look past the violent history. She has to put herself in their shoes and be sympathetic with them. Nobody's putting themselves in her shoes and going, no, we understand that you were going to starve to death if you didn't take this action.
Or understand that our race has a history of enslaving your race, and therefore you would naturally be afraid.
Yeah, or the times where she does express this fear and hatred towards the fairies, they again condemn her for having those feelings rather than being like, yeah, Arby, our bad. We shouldn't enslave people. That doesn't come out until much later, that the fairy characters that she happens to be around were in fact trying to defend the humans. She finds that out much later. And so in those moments where she's like, yeah, I like fear you and I have hatred towards you because of your historical systemic oppression of my peoples, nobody's like, yeah, that's a reasonable feeling.
Right.
That's justified.
Well, even the idea too of like, well, we weren't the fairies that enslaved, so you should be nice to us. And it's like she has no concept of your world. Yeah. All she knows is that at some point humans
and she's
enslaved.
Made to sort of like eat her words and eat her feelings without
over.
knowing that context,
right?
Until it's revealed later, and then she's made to feel guilty for feeling hateful when she didn't know that context, and then that context is revealed later. So this is where I get into how I feel like the book is manipulative.
Right, and again, like it's just something that for some reason we feel like if we want to write women as women, which I don't. Could we just write women as people? Can we just start there?
We've talked about that.
Yeah. Can we not be concerned about like, oh, she needs to come off as female? Mm-hmm. But if we like the idea that in order to write a woman as a woman, she has to feel bad for what she's done.
Right.
You know, and it's like, well, do the fairies feel bad for everything they did to humanity for millennia? Like no one's expressing that, you know, like there's just, it's always just like Feyre has to take on the guilt of everyone else. Mm-hmm. And like, she has to for some reason learn that like to look past it's 500 years it's supposed to be of like
fairy violence.
No, it's like been 500 years since the fairies and the humans like separated. She's got a 500-year history of humanity telling her like these people are bad.
Dangerous.
Yeah, like you should run, you should be scared, you should fight for your life if you see them because they're going to and to be like, hey, you should give up that 500 years of humanity like in an instant. Enraging.
Right. And again, I think there are multiple times where Feyre's put kind of in this position where she has to eat her perspective and nobody is really empathetic with her. And this happens also with one of her older sisters who's very mean and bitter towards her. And then a later reveal is like, oh, well, actually, you didn't understand what her like perspective was. And then it's like, so Feyre is always in this position where she's basically, it's a way of disempowering her from her own instinct and her own feeling and her own right to feel naturally the way that she feels.
Which that is something that happens over and over again when Feyre has her own feelings, when she decides something like
to take action on something.
When she's like I don't want to do this because she's always told that she's wrong.
Right.
She's always told that her feelings are wrong. And like characters will say to her face, you are stupid for feeling that way. When in actuality, all she's doing is saying like, I don't feel safe doing that, so I'm going to do something else.
Right.
And you're stupid for wanting to stay safe.
Yeah. I think this really comes to a culmination, which also brings to a culmination like the stupidity of the wolf situation when the servant, is it Alice?
Alice, yeah.
Reveals, so there's a long like sort of first half of the plot. And by the way, this is going to have spoilers, I feel like.
Oh, yeah, spoilers.
We're going to talk about the end of the book and everything in between. But, you know, there's this point where the first half of the book, we see that Feyre is being taken to Prythian. And there's a lot of hints that are dropped that, like, that we're trying to get Feyre and Tamlin together.
Right.
This is a courtship situation.
Yeah. The world wants these two to get together.
And, like, Lucian is trying to play wingman and he's trying to get these two people together. Right.
I love that he's like trying to play wingman, get these two characters together while also constantly telling Feyre. Yeah, just constantly telling Feyre she's an awful person. Right. But like, why aren't you hooking up with my friend?
Right. You know? So we have that. And then there's like a midpoint where there's dangerous fairies that are encroaching on Tamlin's land. And so Tamlin sends Feyre back home. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. Where Tamlin sends Feyre back home for her safety. And then Feyre decides to come back despite the dangers, to be with Tamlin. And at that point, Alice reveals to her that this whole time there's been a curse, that they couldn't tell her what was going on. But the terms of the curse were that a young girl had to shoot and kill a fairy on human lands, be taken to the fairy lands, and then say, I love you to the fairy lord to break this curse.
Right.
So tell me why anyone ever was mad at her for starting to fulfill the terms of
like,
this curse.
Yeah, like she's doing exactly what they need in order to break this curse, and they're still treating her like trash the entire time.
And then you're supposed to get her to this point where she's going to be in this spot where she can emotionally say, and with sincerity, I love you, and you're just being mean to her the whole time.
Yeah.
Have you been so this is where I start to say, like, oh, this book is setting up a framework where if Feyre as a woman does not respond with gentleness, with vulnerability, and with openness, when people are being abusive to her, she is wrong for doing that. She should be continually opening herself up to be vulnerable emotionally and sexually, as we'll see, to people who are mean and harmful to her.
Right.
Systemically, throughout the novel.
Like, literally everyone in Fairyland exists to manipulate Feyre, right? Because they're all stuck in this curse. They've got masks stuck to their faces. You know, there's an evil queen. Bad things are going to happen if Feyre doesn't say, I love you to Tamlin.
Yeah.
So everyone there exists to manipulate Feyre into saying, I love you.
And you would think that, like, even if they're doing it manipulatively, that their goal would then be like, oh, how can we make this as lovely and as comfortable and as wonderful for her as possible? How can we treat her well with kindness? How can we make her feel loved so that she can respond with love to us? But they're mean to her the whole time.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah. And, like, we want to bring this back to, like, we're not just talking about, like, oh, this is bad writing, and, like, if you like it, that's fine. If I like it, I don't.
Which it is bad writing, but we're not even going to get into that today because we have bigger fish to fry.
What we're talking about is we're bringing this up because we see a reflection of this in culture right now, right? Mm-hmm. Where a lot of young men have it in their head because of culture that to treat women badly is what makes them turn on to you. And they will be attracted to you being mean and just, like, outright unkind to them.
Yeah.
And, like, that is the idea that this book is proposing, that, like, women like to be treated bad. The worse she's treated, the more she falls in love with Tamlin. And that is, we're seeing that in our society.
Yeah.
And it's not going well.
Yeah.
Like, men and women, it's not working well.
Let me just say for the record, there should be no abuse in your intimate partner family dynamics, that you should be treating everyone who is close to you and elsewhere with love and kindness and respect. And whether it's from the scale of negging to outright physical or sexual or emotional abuse, like using that spectrum of behavior as a way to attract people into your life or to say that they owe you intimacy, absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not. This is incorrect. Not only is it illogical, it is wrong.
And it's
morally.
There's so many things about this book that I am seeing in culture right now, and it's hard for me to, like, not wonder, as pervasive as this book is like, is this where it started, or is at least this where it became popular? Like, what?
Yeah. To what extent is it, like, reflecting, reinforcing, you know, so many of the things that were already in culture?
Yeah, because my husband was telling me he got a YouTube ad. He's constantly trying to avoid YouTube ads because they're all directed at, like, oh, you're a young man, you must like X, Y, and Z. And he got one the other day in which a woman comes on the screen and says, women don't want you to treat them well. Stop being nice to women. That's what they don't want you to be nice to them. And it's just like, is this where this is coming from? Are we at very least, like, reinforcing this idea that to treat women badly is how you get them to connect with you? Because it's not. And
yeah.
Ask all the men out there who are giving this a shot and are perpetually single. It's not working. This is not how you attract someone. But, like, this book is telling women, is like the fact that this book is for women is like telling women that you want to be treated like this.
Yeah, isn't it so hot and so excuse me. I have this cold. You guys will have to forgive me. I know I'm blowing my nose and coughing and whatnot. It's like, isn't it so hot and isn't it so sexy? And this is baked into the way that Tamlin treats her as well. So it's not just like, oh, cute, haha, funny, he's awkward, he's stiff, he doesn't know how to talk to a woman. And, like, Lucian is supposed to be this, like, silver-tongued, smooth guy, right? Which... No. Like, you actually have to write characters who embody their characteristics. You can't just tell us stuff. This goes into her being a bad writer. But anyway, you know, it's not just that he is stiff and awkward and doesn't know how to woo a woman. It's also that he does also, well, and we should just go straight into it. There is a moment of assault with this
outright assault. Yeah. We can definitely, we're going to go into detail on that. But yeah, like the there is a fundamental issue with how this romance is written, in that it tells women that like you to be treated badly and to be put down for your attempts to like survive for yourself is what you want. And like that also goes into a theme that we're seeing in the book, where when things are bad, Feyre is fighting for herself. She's self-sufficient. She's saving her family.
Right.
She's very like she's a very self-sufficient person as a whole.
She's taking action to try to find out more about Fairy. She captures that, what is it again?
I don't remember what it's called.
Yeah.
They all have funny names.
I know. She captures this one type of fairy and gets it to tell her, and it's very dangerous, and she's able even to defend herself, and she kills some other fairies that are attacking her and
right.
stuff. So she proves herself a very competent human person,
right,
multiple times in this book.
Her dress, she dresses in a way that she can ensure that if she needs to defend herself
as a hunter,
like ostensibly we want these things in female characters because women should want these things for themselves, like their sense of being able to take care of themselves. But when she's doing this, that is when things are bad.
Yeah,
the world is wrong when Feyre is self-sufficient. The world is right when Feyre is completely taken care of and wearing dresses every day and doesn't do anything, no work, nothing. She basically just exists to be pampered. That is when the world is right.
And she's rewarded.
And she's rewarded for her like embracing that aspect. And like the world that's built, I actually think...
Okay, sorry, say statement.
The world that's built here, I actually think is like the antithesis of what I like in romance. Because what I like in romance is when two characters go on an adventure together and they fall in love while they're on the adventure. The romance, the way that this kind of comes together is Tamlin leaves every day, goes out and does man things, and then comes back and they have dinner. Yeah. And so it's setting up a very traditional structure of man goes out and handles everything, woman stays home and waits for him to come back.
Yeah.
And this is not...
And in this paradigm, the one action that she can take is merely being an emotional comfort,
right,
and saying it's going to be okay to a fairy that's injured that he has to bring back in his like defense of his lands and blah, blah, blah.
She binds up his wounds. She takes care of the sad people. Like she's not in any way engaging in like supporting herself at all. She's just there to be kind of
perform emotional labor
exactly
that none of the men in the circle are able to do.
Right, exactly.
Tamlin isn't able to offer that. Lucian's too freaked out. He runs away when he sees it, and so she sits there and is the emotional sort of safeguard for this.
She in essence becomes the nurse, the nurse figure, the Nightingale figure that we see over and over again in like literary themes of like, oh, there's a woman here, she must be like the nurse.
And then she also kind of has to emotionally husband Tamlin in that moment as well,
right,
which is just like ridiculous. Anyway, but let's talk about specifically how she gets into a dress for the first time.
Oh, good Lord. Okay. I know some people out there are going to defend the situation, and we're going to get into why this situation is not defensible. But for people who maybe haven't read the book or it's been a while, there is like, I think it's called a fire festival.
Yeah, it's like the spring festival. He's the lord of spring in fairy. So it's like this renewal festival. Now, I think thematically it makes sense that the spring festival would be associated with fecundity, with fertility, and that you might have a sexual orgy, as apparently they do.
Yes.
That makes sense thematically. But again, this is a YA book and our main character is 19 years old. We haven't emphasized that enough.
Yeah, let's stop for a second and just sit on the fact that this is a 19-year-old girl, and also a 19-year-old girl with no life experience. Like, she's lived in a very small community, does not even interact very much with that community.
Now taken away from any support system or family members.
Right, she has no support system.
Right, she's now here to be exploited fully by the fairies for their own ends because they're cursed and they need her to fulfill certain things for them. Right, so it's not like they're doing goodwill to her with like no agenda here.
Right, exactly. So yeah, we just say to yourself over and over again, this is a 19-year-old girl
who's been kidnapped in a foreign land.
Exactly. So at this festival, Tamlin, being the king of spring in essence, has like magic put on him where he goes into like basically a sex rage. And it is on page that he will pick a woman to have sex with as part of this. On page, it is said, if he picks a woman and she does not want to have sex with him, too bad. He's going to rape her. Like they make Feyre stay in her room because they're straight up tell her like, oh, if he finds you, he's going to rape you. He won't care what you feel.
He's going to be in another mindset. And the book seeks to exonerate him from responsibility by saying like, oh, it's the fairy magic that like takes over his body. And then he's kind of like in this animalistic beast mode. And it's like what has to be done to rejuvenate the land.
Yeah. And I do want to, before we get to what he does to Feyre, like talk about like the idea of basically all of the women in Spring Fairyland are told from like, it's kind of implied that like this is part of their existence, that they have to go out and give themselves to him. And then if he doesn't choose them, they have to then give themselves to the other men that come out to this festival. Like women in this society are shown to be like manipulating the idea that like you will give your body to men at this time of year. That is a part of it. And like even though we were saying on page like, oh, well, they wanted it. Like if you really step back and think about what we're talking about, these women have basically been given no choice. They have been told their entire lives, you will go out and give your body to this.
Right.
And that's not consent. It's not consent to be like, well, she wanted it, but like no one's ever asked her if she wanted it.
Yeah, it's like, you know, this particular female fairy enjoyed herself under the conditions of which she couldn't have said no anyway.
Right.
So consent can only exist in the opportunity where you can say no free of consequences.
Yeah.
Like you can freely say no and there's going to be no negative consequences to you.
Right. It's not consensual if you're told you have to do this in order for there to be spring. So, you know, like just do it.
Yeah.
That's in and of itself, we need to stop saying that that's okay. Because that whole, before we talk about what happens to Feyre, that whole experience that, you know, is written on stage is not okay.
And let's then say, like, Sarah J. Maas could have organized this fairy festival to be any other way.
Right.
She did not have to include that, like yes, maybe it's a fertility festival or whatever, like then you don't have to put the rules that like women have to be sexual participants against or with their will regardless.
Yeah. Like this isn't actually how spring happens, guys.
Right.
Like
she made this up. She could have made different rules.
Right. Tamlin could have not been in a rage where he has to have what he has. She could have given Tamlin the right to be like, oh, would you like to? And if not, that's fine. But no, like she chose to make Tamlin the state that he's in where he will rape whatever woman he chooses to.
And the culture and the rules of this way.
That is something that Sarah J. Maas came up with.
As opposed to, you know, maybe we're just, you know, doing a flower festival. We could have been picking flowers and it could have been a nice metaphor, guys. That's not the kind of book it is. I get it. We want a little bit of spice. But you can have spice in your romance novels that are consensual.
Right.
And that involves both people enthusiastically saying, yes, I want to participate in this.
Exactly. Right. So that all happens. Feyre's back at the castle because she's been told like, hey, don't go out there because he'll rape you. So
and it's so stupid. Like what 19-year-old is like, oh, let me go to the place where all the R worded, you know, I'd be like, yeah, cool. Can I be even further away behind more locked doors?
So she's been told to stay in her room. She decides, this is on page, people, that she needs a midnight snack.
Well, that she goes to the festival first.
Before she's actually told. Okay, this is another thing I just like get really annoyed with when it's like they tell her like don't come, and she's like, why? And they're like, we can't tell you. But then she comes because they don't tell her that she's actually in danger.
Yeah. And then they're like, you could have gotten R-worded tonight. And they're and then again it becomes that manipulation of like, we told you, you didn't listen, you're a bad person, you should feel guilty. And then Tamlin would have felt so bad if he had taken you in this state, like you should feel guilty for the thing that you almost caused to happen, that you were ignorant. I mean, the number of times that they make her be responsible for things that she didn't even know about. It's so frustrating.
Yeah.
I'm getting frustrated now just thinking about it.
So anyway, the fire festival's going on. She's back at the house. She goes for a midnight snack. Tamlin has decided to come home, still like halfway in his
He's like
rage.
half dazed, yeah.
Right. What is described in this scene is assault.
Yes.
What happens next? There are no questions about it. This is assault. He forces her up against the wall. He bites her to the point where
of drawing blood.
Yeah, he like actually wounds her.
Yeah.
He like
or bruises her.
Yeah, like it's an actual wound, and he does some like
grinding on her, basically.
Yeah. None of which she said he did not ask her if she was open to any of this. None of this she said okay to. He just forces himself on her. And like by like legal standards, like that is a crime that has been committed against her.
Turns out you can't shove women against walls and like bruise them.
Yeah. Like I think that we need to stop and be like, because I know what people say, like, oh, that's just kink. That is not kink. In kink relationships, the partners have discussions about what they are and are not comfortable with prior to engaging in anything. And ground rules are, discussed.
And part of what makes that work is that it is enacting a relationship of power in reversal. This is just a relationship of power, not in reversal, which is like he's 1,000,000 years old. He's a large, muscular man. She's a small, slight female teenager. She's a human in comparison to his fairy magic and power. And she's, again, in this foreign land, trapped in his house, kidnapped, far away from her family. She's 19 years old. How many different ways can we talk about how disempowered she is in this situation?
Yeah. Like there's no way to, because like, honestly, like pull yourself out of the book for a second here. If you are in a relationship in which your partner is causing you physical harm and has never asked you to consider, is this something
that you want to try in our fun time?
Like, yeah, if you've never been given the space to even ask yourself, is this something I enjoy? Then in the real world, we would be like, real bad.
Yeah.
Crimes are being committed. You know?
You should be preparing an exit plan.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't make
Are you familiar with the Marjorie Mason Center? Let me give you the 1-800 number.
Yeah, it doesn't make it better just because it happens to be in a fantasy novel. Like these things are still, this is still a crime. This is still assault.
And when we kind of take it in the context of like the narrative is endorsing it. The narrative is framing this as sexy. The narrative is framing this as like, oh, this is how like the next kind of romantic stage in their relationship is being developed.
Right, because as soon as the next day, Tamlin does this to her. The next day, she starts wearing dresses.
And the first thing that she does in her little dress is says, hey, you come into my private chamber where I am exploring my personal art, which she hasn't had the time or space to do since before she was in human land. She wanted to do it when she was a human. While I think that the descriptions of her as an artist are insufficient because it seems like the only thing that Sarah J. Maas knows about artists is that they think about color. God. Nonetheless, this is one of the core things that's important to her as a person. And she has been given the privilege of having that be her private space with a key that nobody else can go into. And so the first thing that she does is wear dresses so she participates in femininity the way that she has been pressured to do since the first time she got there.
Right.
And then she's supposed to be emotionally vulnerable after being assaulted.
Right. It's very much on page that once he does this to her, that unlocks a level of interest in him that she didn't.
And intimacy and vulnerability.
Like she wants this.
Yeah.
And it's like even if you think that's like have some weird way where that's sexy, honestly think about what a 19-year-old would actually experience in this. And like it's terrifying.
And I do want to say, it may be realistic that some 19-year-olds respond that way, and that is called a trauma response. That's called the fawn response, everybody. Let me lean in real close on the mic.
Well, I mean, I think like
but it's not framed that way in the book. The book isn't saying, oh, look at poor Farah, she's having a fawn response in response to the fact that she's been assaulted. The book is saying like this is how romance is formed between a couple.
This is what causes attraction to each other.
Yeah.
Because like if this book was written from the perspective of like, look what happens when you have a 19-year-old girl who's lived in extreme poverty and she finally meets a man who will like give her food and shelter, which she doesn't have prior to this. Like, yes, she's going to develop an infatuation of him because like this, that is kind of what happens to like people who are in extreme situations.
Right.
But we're not treating it as like, this is a terrible thing that humans have happened to them when they are in desperation in a desperate place. Instead, we're like, this is sexy. And it's like, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not sexy. Like, if this was a real person, we would all be screaming in terror for her.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I want to now talk about, like, the second layer of abuse or the second real instance of extreme abuse that we see. I mean, we see her consent violated by the time we get to the point where she's now come back into Fairy. She's heard from Alice, like, oh, she failed to, and she's blamed heartily for pages while Alice like rages at her for failing to break the curse when she had the opportunity to say, I love you back.
She did not know. I'd like to know, there's a moment where Farah considers saying I love you to Tamlin. And then she has a moment of rational thought where she's like, I am a human. He is like thousands of years.
And it seems like it's been maybe a few weeks since like between like the sexual or the assault scene. I shouldn't say sexual, just really assault. The assault scene. Then they have like a couple of weeks of like romancing time where they're hanging out together and kind of more falling in love with each other. Then they sleep together for the first time and Tamlin says, I love you. And so there's an opportunity for her to say, I love you back. But it's been maybe 2 to 6 weeks in this time frame, it seems like in the book.
Yeah. But Farah has like what a moment of, I would say like, is like honestly a good logic. She's like, why would I like say I love you to you when like I as a human, you know, will never live as long as you. We can never have an actual relationship. This will never be a thing. So I, as the human, am going to protect myself and remove myself from the situation.
Nope. Bad. Bad, Farah.
The book literally calls her stupid repeatedly for having that sense of self-preservation. Yeah. And it's like, this is like something another thing I get really frustrated about is like when women have any sense of like, I should be safe, we say, no, you should be throwing yourself into the fray for the man you love. You should not, your safety should not be important.
Right. And I think that's something that kind of comes up over and over again. And it makes Farah, from like my readership position of being an adult woman, like be like, oh, this is a woman, a young girl who's been so exploited, she has no self-esteem left. Right. So her response when she gets this news from Alice is like, yes, let me, the tiny, frail human being in this world of magic and powerful fairies, go voluntarily put myself under the mountain and sacrifice my well-being, my safety, possibly my life in service of this man that I've hung out with for a few weeks in a positive way. Prior to that, totally negative, and you know, they're at loggerheads and in conflict with each other.
Right. She's like the psychological weight that she's being asked to handle, right? Like Tamlin, yes, we're like told that like he feels really bad about the situation these people are in and it makes him very depressed and blah blah blah. But like he's never actually asked to like sacrifice that much. She's asked to sacrifice her world. She's asked to sacrifice her family. She's asked to sacrifice her culture. She's asked to like give up what her culture has taught her for, you know, her entire life. She's asked to give up her body. That's like that comes up. Like she's asked to sacrifice her body and then ultimately her life. What is Tamlin sacrificing?
Yeah, all he's doing is being like, oh, thank you for saving all of Spring Fairylands.
Yeah. Basically.
Cool. Oh, not even that. She saves like all the fairies.
She saves all the fairies. And like in the meantime, like Tamlin gets laid. And like that's just like he just kind of gets a lot of benefits without having to give up anything.
Yeah, the weight of how their relationship is counterbalanced is so uneven. And it's like counterbalanced in the opposite way in terms of power. And so it's just so messed up. So anyway, so then she goes down to Fairy, and she's now put into a new wager with Fairy, because, you know, fairies like to do that, which I think is like a good detail that
it's a tradition within the fairy lore.
Yeah. So she makes this wager, she makes this deal, and so she's going to go through her 3 trials. I wonder if she's going to defeat them.
This is not the point of the story, but can I just say, like, why the hell would the evil queen give Farah a way to defeat her? Why wouldn't the evil queen just be like, die? You know, like this, I want what I want.
Answer my riddles 3. What is my favorite color? Okay.
Yeah. So basically, Farah finds out that Tamlin and all the other fairies in the world have been put underneath this mountain by an evil queen. And she, a 19-year-old girl, has now put the weight of saving all of fairy
on her own shoulders.
Yeah.
And she takes the sun. She feels like she is responsible for it.
Right.
It's not like, oh, you're welcome, I'm doing you this huge solid. It's like, no, I should do this for the good of Fairy because I love Tamlin, who I finally decided I might be attracted to about 4 weeks ago. You know, it's like, no. Anyway, but I'm sounding like I'm 85, which in fact, in my soul I am. But then we have these other moments of non-consent. So as a result of her getting injured in various circumstances, who's that other character? What's his name? Oh, Rysand.
Rysand.
So then she has to make deals with Rysand. So
Right,
this
so
is
she's
one of the ones that really gets under my skin.
So she's injured to the point where she knows she's dying.
Yeah, she has a fever. Her arm is broken. She has no way to heal it, or even like bind herself up.
Right.
Right.
So
she is going to die from this wound.
Right, exactly. So the choice given to her is do what this man wants or die.
Yeah.
Which is not really giving someone a choice.
Again,
that's not a choice.
When you cannot say no, it's not consent. So then she obviously makes this deal. He heals her with his fairy magic, but in the process, he puts a tattoo on her. Right. Which we also later, like throughout the next phase, kind of go like, oh, he either might be spying on her or he's emotionally tied to her through this tattoo. Like he's able to sort of like psychically connect to her emotions, and there's an eye in it, and it's sort of like, are you kind of present with me here psychically as a result of this tattoo? So that's also not consensual.
Right. Like he's,
by the way,
marking her body and like knitting her consciousness to his consciousness. This is not anything she agreed to.
Right.
Like she
that was not part of the wager.
Yeah. Like she did not agree to any of that. That is forced on her.
Her first thought when she sees that she's got this full sleeves tattoo is not, oh, I didn't want a tattoo. Or, oh, cool, I've always wanted a tattoo. I like it, I don't like it. Her first thought is, oh, when Tamlin sees this, he's going to be mad, which is already kind of putting in this framework that her body doesn't belong to her. Her body belongs to Tamlin.
Right.
And it's just so gross.
It
makes me so mad.
Like, yeah. The idea that like this deal she makes ends up like psychically connecting her to Rhysand, also like in and of itself, like the amount of violation that is, like that he can now read her thoughts and think.
Because there's also like this moment where it's like there's a couple of different moments where you kind of like realize like, oh, she's realizing that he's able to pick up on her emotions through this tattoo. But one of them is when at the end of the story where she's able to reunite with Tamlin and they're having sex, and Rysand comes in and comments on how much she must have enjoyed that, which is gross.
It's creepy.
And a huge violation of privacy and consent. Okay?
And again, the reason that we're bringing this up is because this book is telling women this is okay.
Yeah.
This book is telling women that you should be treated like this. It's okay.
Not only is it okay, it's desirable, it's hot, it's sexy. Isn't this so much fun for all of these men in her world to be constantly violating boundaries, privacy, consent, as if like she just and her will is constantly stripped from her. Like we're saying, on all of these fronts, not only is it that her will is constantly stripped from her, the degree to which she concedes that she should be a malleable object and puppet in their hands is the degree to which she's rewarded, which is literally how patriarchy works in our society.
Yeah, this is harmful. Yeah. Like women who actually experience this in the real world it's not a good experience. Like it's very harmful.
Yeah, and even if you're getting rewards from either intentionally or unintentionally fulfilling the expectations of patriarchy, that's part of the power system conditioning you to participate in it.
Telling you this is what you want. You want to experience what is harm, you know?
Yeah. Like we'll reward you for going along with it and we'll punish you for not. To whatever extent and control that you can. So anyway, so that happens. And it made me mad. But let's get into the drugged dancing.
Oh, yes. So again, let's stop again and say, this is a 19-year-old girl.
Yep.
This is a 19-year-old girl with very little life experiences. She is stripped of her clothing and painted, and it's very clearly stated that her private parts are painted
by fairy slaves.
Yeah, like without her consent. They are allowed to touch all body parts without her consent.
She is made to wear basically like a little see-through 2 panels of fabric that's belted together, and it's all considered like kind of very sheer. Like
very sheer.
She might as well be naked.
Yeah, she's basically naked.
Right.
She is brought out to the fairy court in front of all the fairies. She is given wine so that
fairy wine that makes her very intoxicated.
Yeah. And she repeatedly says, I don't want to drink this, because she knows it will make her intoxicated, and she's given no choice.
And she's been warned not to drink it.
Yeah. And she doesn't want to. She straight up says, I don't want to drink the wine.
Right.
She is forced to drink the wine. She becomes very, very intoxicated. And night after night, this happens to her, and she is forced to do sexual dances in front of the entire Sorry. Like, it's even on page that she is like vomiting because she's being forced to do this, and they let her vomit and then they force her to go back up and do the sexual dance again.
Right. And this is framed as like, well, Rysand was there and she was dancing on Rysand, but he's there to sort of like quasi protect her. And if he's there, and it's like, no.
No.
I'm sure Rysand wasn't enjoying this woman who he's clearly attracted to dancing upon him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I want to just frame this too, like, so this is because I thought this was a thought that like came to me, which is like because there's two ways that patriarchy works, right? And so you have the patriarchy of a father to a daughter, and you have the patriarchy of a male lover to a woman object, right? And so what we're seeing here is like, oh, isn't it so fun and sexy when a woman gets drugged up and does sexy dances that is pleasurable to the male audience? And isn't that so? And then like the female audience of power here, because they're fairies, right? They think, oh, that's embarrassing and denigrating for her. And so they get off of it by elevating themselves in power above her through this act, right? Yeah. And then if you take the same exact scene and you put it in the movie Taken with Liam Neeson going to protect his daughter, and it's the same thing. The girl is dressed in skimpy clothes, sheer panels, drugged up, and made to stand and waggle in front of billionaires because they're going to wager on all of these girls that they've now kidnapped to see who they want. Suddenly, it's the man's duty to go protect her, right? And so, but both of these dynamics still put the woman as an object. It's just what is the male relationship to her, and what is he going to do about it?
Right. Well, and let's not forget the justification for, because Rhysand, who is ultimately her true love in this story, like it doesn't happen in this book, but it happens in Rhysand is the one who comes up with this and does this to her, and he's claiming that what he's doing is like purposefully enraging Tamlin so that once Tamlin can finally fight the evil queen, he'll be super mad about it.
He'll be so mad.
Yeah.
He'll be like so mad, bro.
Like
I don't even like it when you dance on me though. Like, ew. I'm not doing it for my personal gratification at all. Like, no, it's like I'm just trying to piss off Tamlin because he's such a little punk.
Yeah, I like the idea of like Tamlin can't defeat the evil queen unless he sees her drunkenly sexually dancing night after night.
Yeah, and Rhysand, again, putting his hands all over her without his consent.
Right. Like that.
I mean, her consent.
That is something that Sarah J. Maas came up with, guys.
Yeah.
Like, that's not actually true. Tamlin could probably fight the evil queen.
Yeah.
He doesn't need the fuel of this happening.
Yeah, he's been cursed for 50 years or however, 100 years. I don't know. I'm sure he's got a lot of resentment built up.
Right. Like, this is not necessary. What Farah experiences in the whole...
you could frame it as like a horror film. You know, you just switch the like tone of it, and those same actions are like, oh my God, wouldn't it be horrible if you were kidnapped by a guy with a ski mask and he made you get drunk and dance around like that. And then you do the boobily like shot of the girl like screaming. Like, it's a horror film from a different lens. You know what I mean? The same exact thing. Okay, editing Alexandra here. I wanted to expand a little bit more on this comparison to horror and some of the similarities that I'm seeing, which I know that Emily would geek out with me on if she were here, because she has a love for the Gothic. She has a love for monster romance, and it really ties in with the point that I'm trying to make here. So I recently watched Princess Week's Nosferatu video that she just posted, and I haven't watched the movie Nosferatu, but I think the comparison is like profound between Acotar and how it functions as propaganda and Nosferatu, and how it actually explores the tension and discomfort and eroticism and desire to submit, but the structures that be. So anyway, in Nosferatu, we obviously have it set in Victorian times with the costuming and the historical period and all of its references to the Gothic genre. And it is by choosing to remain in that historical period, really being explicit about its understanding that women were very much constrained historically with their rights and all of these different things. At the same time, it doesn't portray Nosferatu as anything other than a monster. He is ugly, he's horrifying, he's violent, he is scary. And it recognizes the fear inherent in the choices that, your female protagonist has to make in choosing to submit how much can she choose, under threat of violence, under threat of losing everything that she loves and cares about, every person that she loves and cares about, and that sort of thing. And so it understands that the choice is monstrous while also linking it with the eroticism of the moment, right? And so it understands this ambivalence and this sort of strange constraints that female sexuality operates under when we're recognizing these systems that constrain female choice. And on the flip side, I think you see it in, like, I've seen a lot of comedy clips where it's like women are lamenting being straight in this time because it's like, oh, I'm attracted to men, but men fall so short in many women's expectations of true partnership, right? And so that's the comedic version of this same complaint. By contrast, with Acotar, we have no recognition. You know, we're not in Victorian times. The lens that's put on this camera is not gray and drizzly. There isn't rain. There isn't a haunted castle. It's portrayed as this heavenly sort of existence. And the more that Farah leans into accepting the structures around her, the more heavenly it seems. The more she's given fairy sight, and the world seems much more beautiful, and she can hear the birds, and she's connecting with her artistic self. So that's part of the propaganda, is that, like, fairyland, Prithian, is this beautiful, golden, light-filled, airy, heavenly space. It is not portrayed as a place of horrors. And likewise, her two romantic partners that are set up for her in Tamlin and Rysand are both put forth as handsome and desirable, and there's no monstrous qualities about them at all. Meanwhile, they're enacting violence on her, they're harming her, they're asking similar levels of sacrifice of, like, oh, unto the point of death, you must sacrifice yourself for the savior of Prithian, in the same way that we see that sacrifice being required in Nosferatu. And so that's why I keep returning to this idea that I see something like an Acotar operating as propaganda, as opposed to honestly trying to reckon with the tensions and even uncomfortable feelings that we find with our own female desire that may come up, that everything that we desire, as Princess Week says, is not necessarily good, but, like, reckoning with the fact that, like, some of these desires that we have within ourselves are themselves monstrous. And Acotar, by contrast, like, it hits the same beats as a horror novel, but tries to tell me that I'm in heaven. And that is what I, like, struggle with so much with this book.
Farah experiences so much physical violence, sexual violence, emotional trauma, mental trauma, so much in this, like, last third of the book. At some point, it kind of becomes very sadistic.
I agree.
Like, why are we reading this? Like,
I
what?
Agree.
It's
like,
gross.
Yeah, you kind of walk away from, like, especially for the stuff that happens under the mountain, where you're just like Sarah J. Maas, are you okay? Like,
yeah.
I walked away being like, whoa, like, you hate women, like,
it's nasty.
Yeah, like, it's a mean-spirited approach to women. It's like whoa.
Yeah, like, because, like, it goes all the way to the end of, like, Farah literally being broken in half.
Yeah.
Like, she's just, like, beaten to death on screen. Like, we're watching this happen where she's just savagely beaten. And then, like, that's not the only time that happens. Like, she's repeatedly savagely beaten. Like, the amount of violence like, Farah gets hit more than any of the other characters in this book. And it just comes to a point where I'm just like, why did you write this character just to do this to her? Like, it's disturbing.
It's very disturbing.
Yeah.
And then there, like, to add to your point, there's also that scene where she is forced to murder innocent fairies,
right,
with her own hand. Also sadistic. Any person with an ounce of empathy, and, you know, and it's a very, like, drawn out and painful scene, and she's really like, oh, it's the right thing to do, I don't really know, you know, she's really worried about this, as anyone be. I think that's very realistic, you know, but it's like, that's sadistic, that's torture.
Yeah, like it does go into the range of, like, torture porn, like, where, like, the whole I finally finished this book. It was like, I just, like, feel wretched now because I just spent, like, a third of this book with this character just being, like, disgustingly, savagely treated,
right?
You know, on so many different levels. Like, the things that happen to Farah are so many different levels.
I'm gonna sneeze. Now that I said it, I won't. Look at the sun. No, okay, it's passed.
Yeah, like, it's it's just, it becomes to a point where I'm just like this is unwell. Like I don't understand anybody actually enjoying reading this and like what they got out of this, because it gets to a level where it's just gross.
It's very mean spirited. So, and I think that like that kind of goes back to like me feeling like, you know, this book is very manipulative, because, and one of the other reasons why I feel that way, and this kind of goes back to the level of craft, which I know we weren't going to talk about very much, but one of the things that I noticed that Sarah J Maas does a lot is she doesn't seem to either want to or know how to actually write characters who are likable in and of themselves by giving them characteristics that make them likable people. But instead what she does is she gives people very tragic backstories. So obviously Feyre has her tragic backstory, and we see, you know, how badly she feels about herself and how badly she's treated by her family, and we're supposed to have empathy for her. Then we like get to know Tamlin, and we see like, oh, he was treated badly by his dad and by his brothers, and he tried to do what was right, blah, blah, blah. Then we see Lucian. Oh, he was treated badly by his dad, and blah, blah, blah. He has this tragic backstory. Then we see Alice, and we're like, oh, this tragic thing happened to your sister and blah, 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 and the babies, and you know. And so instead of actually being able to give us something to like, all she can do is kind of give them tragic circumstances, and circumstances are not the same thing as characteristics.
Right.
So I always kind of felt manipulated by that as I moved through the novel. But then we kind of get to this spot where it's like, well, I feel like I'm being manipulated into thinking that like assault and sexual abuse and emotional abuse is hot and sexy, and I should be like, the way that the book is like rooting for this, and I don't really like that feeling. And then I feel like we kind of get to this point where, you know, and again, I feel like Farrah is being manipulated throughout this whole story. So it just I just felt like so manipulated by this book.
Right. And I think I kind of like to circle back to one piece with that, because I feel like this book has a worldview, right? Like it's a very obvious worldview about women and what women's place is, and you know what women should be doing. And I see that like worldview gaining in popularity right now, and I feel like there's an attitude of like, well, if she wants to be like this, what's the big deal? And I think it needs to be addressed, like why this worldview is very negative, because there was a point in history in which most women, at least in this country, you know, were living like this life, right? Where like guy takes care of me, guy goes out every day, I stay at home, everything's, you know, happy-go-lucky, right? But the reality is, and why we tried to change that in our society, is that leaves women in an extremely vulnerable situation.
Same position is that if the society is set up in such a way that she can't say no.
Right.
She can't have a bank account. She can't have a credit card. She's not allowed to go out and get a job. She's, you know, there's all of these hindrances for her to have another option. Then that's not consent. Right. And that was true in the 1950s.
Right. Well, and
when these things were structured that way.
It also relies on the idea that like every situation that this is in, like you have to be assured that like men will always be there and everything will be perfect in order for this system to work. Because if the man that you're married to or a partner with, if anything goes wrong with him, women are and their children.
Let alone like you could be married to the most wonderful benevolent, moral, upstanding man who doesn't shove you up against a wall and bruise your neck. You know, you could be married to somebody like that, and yet he might die in a tragic accident.
I knew someone who like got married straight out of high school, was never in a situation where she had to fully care for herself. Her husband was wonderful. He also dropped dead very suddenly at 40 years old. And she immediately put herself and her children into a dangerous situation because she didn't know how to survive on her own. Right. She didn't know what it was like to live without a man in her life. So she chose to go with a very abusive man just to be not without a man. And I've seen that happen like so many times. I know women who got married thinking they were marrying the greatest guy ever, and then life circumstances made him very bitter, and he turned into, you know, alcoholic and an abuser, and she had never been on her own. So she stayed and she let herself and her children be abused. Like when we put women in, we tell women that this is the best option for them, we immediately put them in danger. We put their children in danger. And even if we just want to talk about like on the financial scale, there are so many families that hold to this structure who live in extreme debt or poverty because it's not actually financially feasible. Yeah, it looks great when you are Tamlin and you have millions and millions and, a castle.
Or you're, the ballerina farm or whatever and your dad owns JetBlue.
Yeah, like, okay, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But like the majority of people are trying to like eke out an existence. And if we're telling women, oh, you're bad for helping support your family, and we make you feel guilty for having to have any supply for the family.
Right, which directly relates to Farah going out and hunting and protecting her family and serving her family, or even taking action for her own self-defense.
Right. Like we tell, like I live in this world. I've seen this happen so many times where women are made to feel bad that they have to help support the family. You know, that's how we end up with so many people in debt and in poverty. Like it doesn't have to be, like you don't have to put your children in an impoverished state simply to be morally superior.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the difficult thing is when you say like, oh, well, I'm just going to choose to participate in this kind of way of being and it doesn't affect you. It's like, no, the whole world, you have a community. The choices that we make affect other people, whether we intend it to or not. You actually make it harder for other women not to.
I mean, yeah. And what
and like you said, often when women are decide to participate in this kind of structure, maybe they didn't mean to. They end up in a relationship with somebody who is not safe. They're often putting family members at risk, sisters, children, other people. Then we have to, you know, spend resources to try and get you back out of that situation if you come to the point where you say, yeah, I want out. Or, you know, or even just friends. You put friends at risk. I have been around girls, especially like in my college years, who were so boy crazy and wanted to go like do different things where it's like I was in unsafe situations because I'm like going, well, I'm not going to leave you alone with this guy, but I think we should get out, but you want to stay and flirt with him. And now there are 3 and I don't know anybody else here. And we need to get out, but you're not paying attention. So there's all of these different ways where you put people at risk because you're so focused on falling in love, getting married, doing this whole thing without doing it within the parameters of what's being responsible for yourself and for the other people in your community.
Right. I mean, and this goes in terms of like what I see online and what I see in culture, like this goes so far beyond, you know, just being like, oh, this is my life stories. 'Cause I've literally seen like women online be like, how's that STEM thing working out for you? My husband takes care of me. And it's like there are so many women out there who have to fend for themselves, and the way the internet treats them, like, oh, you're such a failure that you have to fend for yourself, which is like what the book says, right? Like whenever Farah is fending for herself, she's doing wrong. Yeah. She should be letting Lucian and Tamlin do things for her. So we have a system that like automatically denigrates women simply because of the circumstances that they end up in. There are a lot of women who have to fend for themselves. They have no other choice.
Yeah, and there's lots of families that can't afford for, you know, just the man to be the person right. You know, getting the paycheck.
Yeah. And for like other women to come on to social media and be like, well, my man takes care of me. Like why do you need to hurt? Yeah. Like, why do you need to hurt like that? But I've seen that so often being like, first of all, like it's an outrageous level of privilege if that's the existence that you have. Yeah. Second of all, I'm not really sure that it is actually what you're portraying because a lot of people look like that on the outside and are actually an outrageous debt on the backside.
Yeah. And I think too, like, you know, to put it into like commodification terms, a lot of times and this kind of going back to like, I don't know if you're familiar, like the sprinkle and that kind of philosophy in terms of dating. Are you familiar? Okay. Where it's like, you know, you get your bag, honey. Like you make sure that man's paying for you is kind of like the attitude, right? And it's like, well, you can only do that, first of all, if you happen to be privileged with looks. That's the only way that like a man who's extremely wealthy is going to be interested in a woman like you. Right. It's like you would have to have like model good looks, first of all. And the second thing is that you're commodifying your beauty and you're trading your beauty for money and for financial stability. Probably, you know, putting yourself in a power differential that's not favorable, I'm going to guess. But also like you're trading, and this is like purely in economic terms, this is harsh, but you're trading a depreciating good for one that's not. So like good luck as time goes on, because time is your enemy if you're going to say, I'm going to buy into that system and that's how I'm going to run my life.
So basically what we're saying is the worldview in this book, the attitude towards women is actually harmful to women. Yeah. Like women are the ones who will suffer in this structure. Like we are the most vulnerable in this worldview that it's creating. And like the rest, like everybody is just like taking these in. I think that's what, like, we need to talk about thoughtful readership.
Yeah.
Right. Because like I totally get having books you read for the fun of it. Romance is where I go when I'm like, I have had too much today and I just want to be happy.
Sure.
So I'm going to go read a romance novel. And I don't have any problem at all with people reading for fun.
Yeah.
But there is this concept of, I'm reading for fun, therefore I've turned my brain off and I'm not taking in anything else than fun. And that is not how your brain works.
Right.
And your brain will always be taking in what's being told.
Yeah, there's no way to be neutral about these things. If you're taking it in, then you're endorsing it. If you're not able to sort of combat it and go, hey, wait a minute, this seems like this narrative is really, really mean to Feyre. And I don't even like Feyre as a character. I thought she was kind of annoying. And yet by the end of it, I was like, dear God, like what didn't you do to this poor girl?
I know, it's insane.
And so,
it's okay to have a value system. And when you read a book, that book goes against your value system, to be like, oh, I don't like that. That went against my value system. But instead, we're so comfortable with being like, the reader told me it was right, so it's right. Like, no, you can say to the writer,
with the framework of the novel.
You can say to the writer, actually, no, that's not right. I don't have to accept it simply because in this narrative, you're trying to tell me I have to accept it.
Yeah, and like I said, I've definitely, I have read and enjoyed books that I have disagreed with, and I think that that's possible. It's hard for me to get into the headspace of reading this so thoughtlessly that it is enjoyable to read. I think that's really hard for me to even like kind of empathetically try to put myself in the shoes, because I was so like offended and appalled. I felt like the book had sort of like slapped me across the face because I was a woman. Like by the time what I mean? Like it was a very offensive experience.
Yeah.
Like I kind of finished and was like, well, I don't like you either. Like, geez, you seem like a real mean person and a big meanie, like that's kind of how I felt when I finished the book. So it's hard for me to kind of like put myself in the shoes where like this experience could be enjoyable, especially for a woman. Like I felt like it was just so harsh and mean and denigrating and, abusive, but also like just like grinding your face in the embarrassment of being a woman almost.
Right. And like we need to get over the idea that women can be misogynistic towards women. They can absolutely.
Internalized misogyny is the answer to that question.
Yeah. I don't think that you can be like, oh, it was written by a woman, so it's not bad towards women. Like that, we can throw that one right out the window. Like the ideas that are expressed about women, even though it's written by a woman, are super harmful and weird and negative and gross. And like women should be treated better than women are treated in this book.
Yeah. Yeah. I would just say is like, if the narrator, and again, I like separating it from the author. I think there's reasons why we should be criticizing Sarah J. Maas, but typically my process is, let's look at what the narrative point of view of the book is, because we can't necessarily one-to-one equate that with the author's personal opinions, right? And but like, I would wager to guess that a lot of this is kind of coming out unconsciously from Sarah J. Maas's like psyche as she's writing these stories, and she was really young when she wrote it, and I certainly didn't have the most sophisticated views. I think she was like in her early 20s. I didn't have the most sophisticated views when I was 20. However, again, context of who she was that we said at the beginning, and some of the choices that she's made about how she presents herself politically and how she deals with racial ideas. all of that for context. But like, if the narrator were a human being and like popped up and existed, I would be like, I don't want to be friends with you. Like you are a person that not only would I be like wary of because you're dangerous, I would be certainly avoidant of you at like if that person existed and they popped up and they had these opinions.
Right.
I would be like, nah, like you are no good, like danger, red flags. Nope, don't be friends with that. Don't work with that person. Avoid them at all costs. Like they would be on like my watch list of like people where I'd be like, where are you going? What are you about?
I think that like, this is the kind of book that I think the negative ideas are so prevalent that it is okay to boil them down to the ideas because it's not just like, oh, this one
it's like
scene,
hinting at.
Yeah, like we're thinking about things or we hinted at something. Like there's so much that's on page and so much that is straight in your face. Like this book has intense ideas. And so I think it's okay to directly like engage with it on its ideas.
Right, 100%.
Like it's not, in a lot of ways, it's not really a fantasy novel to me because the idea about the ideas being expressed are so in your face. I feel like I get more caught up in like, what is it trying to tell me?
Yeah,
Because
so the politics of the book are certainly preeminent. They're preeminent over character. It's hard to say because I feel like plot is very preeminent in this book, but it's certainly preeminent over setting or world building. And we didn't really get to go into all of those things, but like, and it's not relevant at this point. But like, yeah, this book, and it was ham-fisted throughout, and it's ham-fisted both to accomplish the stages in the plot that it's trying to get to, but the stages in the plot are the means by which these politics are expressed, because it's what happens to Feyre, basically.
Yeah, it's a story. The story is not Feyre and Tamlin. The story is, what the hell are we doing to Feyre now? Because it's just like a constant assault
barrage
on her as a character. Like, I agree. I didn't really like Feyre as a character. Like, you know, it's not someone I would really like, I feel like, enjoy. But at the same time, like, I felt so bad for her by the end of it. Like, she deserves so much better than what she's given.
Well, because it's just so inhumane.
Yeah.
Any human deserves better than being treated like that, even in a fictional narrative. So, yeah, it's just an abusive narrative. The narrative as a whole is abusive. And so, and I do want to sort of like, okay, I want to kind of like pause. We've said our piece. I think our opinion is clear. I don't know that we've minced too many words about it.
No.
But I do want to pause because there is something that I always find interesting and I always want to question. And I said this at the time when Twilight happened, and this is sort of like Twilight 2.0, because there was a period where Twilight was super popular and we were like, oh no, maybe Edward's an abusive boyfriend and we should not be fully endorsing this, which again wrapped it in this very romantic, sexy kind of highly endorsing kind of language. So this is definitely an inheritor of that kind of worldview. And it's sort of like, okay, but let me pause and take a step back and say, okay, well, what is going on that narratives like this are so compelling to so many women? Because I read it and I go, oh no. Oh, I feel offended. I almost feel like crying that like someone has this kind of, like, it's almost like a rageful bitterness towards women that gets expressed through the narrative. And I think I'm frightened and I'm hurt that there's like someone out here who has like kind of like vitriol. Right. And yet there are women out here who both find it compelling and it's sexy and it's something that they want to return to over and over again. And is it like, is it that we are so many women we're still so wrapped up in the ways that society abuses us that it feels so resonant. It feels so familiar. It seems to give a sense of adventure and purpose to the type of suffering that you are currently experiencing in your life, but you haven't quite processed where and why it's coming from.
Right. Because ultimately, Feyre, I wouldn't personally call this a reward, but Feyre is like ultimately rewarded in the book for up to the point of dying for Tamlin. She's given immortality. Which like there is a sense even in that where I feel like that was a lack of agency because
she didn't ask for mortality.
She didn't ask to be a fairy.
Never once in the story did she say, oh, I want to be a fairy. Unlike, again, to go back to the Twilight thing, what's her face? Bella is like, no, I want to be a vampire. I want to live forever with Edward.
Right. Like Feyre is not given that choice.
There's only a couple of things that she expresses. She goes back and forth on whether she wants to be at home or be in Prythian, which like your feelings can change over time based on the circumstances as you learn more. But there's two things. One is that she really enjoys painting and she enjoys making her home a lovely place for her family to be by painting it. So she gets to do that for like about 4 days. And the other thing that she expresses that she wants to do is her little sister goes, oh, wouldn't it be great to go to the continent, presumably the counterpart to Europe, in this British Isle situation. And she goes, yeah, I would really like to do that with my sister. And then when she leaves to go back to Prythian, she regrets that she won't be able to do that with her sister. Those are the two things that she expresses that she wants to do. I have a feeling, because of Sarah J. Maas having poor character development, that we will not see Feyre painting again in the rest of the books. Everybody who's read the books, you'll have to tell me if that comes up, that she's able to connect with the things that she truly enjoys. And she certainly doesn't go to the continent with her sister. So again, when we're talking about consent and her having agency, never once does she say like, oh, I really want to be a fairy. I want to live forever. Oh, this place is so wonderful. I wish I could stay here. That is not on her agenda. That's not what she wants. And then the fairies are just like, there you go. Of course you want to be like us.
That's
Why
right.
wouldn't you want to be like us?
Yeah. There's no... Her ultimate reward,
even in the moment where she's like, oh, I probably shouldn't say I love you back to Tamlin because I'm a human, and she never even thinks like, oh, I wish I were a fairy because then we could be together. No, that doesn't come up at all.
No, it's very clearly like, I see myself as a human and he's a fairy, and so this is probably not going to work, right? Like what she's ultimately rewarded with is she is now a fairy. So now which in essence completely breaks her away from any chance of being a part of her own culture again, right? Because now she's become the thing that her world hates.
Like, yeah, it's like now she like perhaps could have gone home and gone back to be with her family because like the curse is resolved and all of that. Like, no need for her to stay in Prithian anymore. Go home, be with your family. They're wealthy. Yeah. You get to live like the highest society life in like human terms.
Right. But now that's been taken away from her. She has now in essence become the thing that, you know, her society hates. Which, like, to be clear, the problem with, like, I know everyone's just be like, oh, but she, you know, being a fairy, wonderful, blah, blah, blah. Like, the point is we are never allowed to, like, just have Feyre choose. Like, nothing is ever given a choice. And then on top of
that, like, let's pretend that you've been enslaved for a millennia by a people group. Maybe based on the way that you look or your race or because your people were conquered or something like that. If they were like, oh my God, we're going to give you the opportunity to be just like us. Would you ever want that?
Right.
They would be like, no, I don't want to be like the evil people who have been enslaving me for a millennia.
Yeah. But even still, like, the narrative just needs to ask. Like, the narrative never asks Feyre what she wants. The narrative never asks Feyre if she's okay with this. The narrative just constantly smashes it into her and then says, you like it.
Yeah.
You're happy
gonna
with
like
it. Yeah, you're going to like this.
Which is like, you know, one of the first things I said is like, this book is propaganda for rape culture. And the whole book is like raping Feyre over and over again. Not to be vulgar, but it's like, you will like it. You will take it. Say you like it. Say you enjoy it.
Right.
You know, it's like, God. If that's like why you like, I like walked away from this book being like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Like, what the heck?
Yeah. When I finally ended it and like, she and Feyre are going back to the, you know, the castle, and there's the sound of Alice's kids laughing in the background. And I'm just like, I don't feel happy. Yeah. I do not feel happy right now. I feel really awful. Like I feel like Feyre needs some time away from you, Tamlin. And like I do also love in the scene, like she like is brought back from death, but she's still horribly traumatized. And the first thing Tamlin is like, okay, let's have sex.
Right.
Like exactly. She like literally wakes up and it's like, okay, we're going to have sex now, right?
Yeah. Like, I hope you're ready for this. I know what really gets ladies in the mood. Waking up from a coma.
Yeah.
Truly the horniest time for a woman. It's up there with being 9 months pregnant, you know?
I'm still wrapping my head around like what you just did to me, but you want to have sex? Okay. Like that's how it's framed. Yeah. That is how the story is framed.
It's wild. It is wild. So all of that to get back to this question of like, you know, there's part of me that like, I want to, like, in the midst of my vehemence of my feelings, because I can't help it, because I feel like I was so offended by this work, like so deeply offended by this work as a woman, as a human being. So it's, again, really hard for me to get back into the shoes of like, oh, someone read this and enjoyed it. And in fact, I have people in my circle who I know have read it and enjoyed it. And, you know, and I do want to hold with an open hand, like, could you tell me what it was?
Yeah.
Because this book seems so unforgivable.
Yeah.
I can't find the pockets of what it could be that would, and I don't mean to be condescending, and I don't mean to be mean to the readers who do enjoy it, and I don't mean to be one of the many thousands who are criticizing. I'm not trying to criticize reader behavior. I'm criticizing the words on the page. I'm trying to hold the work itself to account for what it itself says. But as another woman, if you are a female reader of this work, I am curious, after hearing everything that we've had to say, do you look at this work the same way? Do you know, were any of these things apparent to you when you read it?
Yeah.
You know, what was going through your mind when you read it, and like, you know, maybe we've been persuasive, maybe not. If we have been, if we've shown you like the ways in which this book is presenting a world of violence and oppression, and especially sexual violence towards women, and especially young, disempowered, isolated young women, do you feel like you could encounter the book in the same way? And if you went back and read those scenes with Tamlin, would they feel sexy to you, or would they feel sordid in the way that they do for me?
Right. Like, it does kind of beg the question, like, if you read this and you're not seeing this, like, what has happened in your own life? What influences have had on you that, like, you're okay?
Yeah.
Like, after reading this and being like, oh, that's okay. It's okay that happened to Farah. No, that's fine. Like what's going on inside you that you're okay with this? Because like it's a little bit scary to me.
Yeah.
Like, it's scary to me that, because if you're okay with this happening to Farah, like, you're in essence saying you're okay with happening it to yourself. And like, are you? Yeah. Are you okay with this happening to yourself? Because if you are, like, that's scary to me.
Yeah. And I think, you know, and I do want to kind of open up a wedge in what you just said, which is like, yeah, we read a lot of adventure stories where it's like, oh, I don't want to go be in the Hunger Games, but I enjoy reading the story of the Hunger Games, or I enjoy reading the story of Frodo carrying the ring. I don't want to carry the ring to Mount Doom, you know? So there's a wedge of like, oh, there are stories that we can enjoy where it's like, I'm not necessarily saying I want to do that.
But I think I'm specifically talking about the romance aspect of it. And like women, the way women want to be treated by men.
And so I want to open that wedge so it would clarify.
Yeah.
If you,
we're not talking about like, oh, you want to read fantasy novels.
Right.
That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah. And it's like, and is it possible to read books where, you know, less than perfect relationships happen and it's fun to go on the journey with the characters in a romance? Yes. But the problem is where did we land? Where do we stick the landing? Because a lot of times what I hope we would do, you know, in things that because I think, again, there's lots of romances out there that do this well, is that we stick the landing with the characters in a healthy place where they're kind and respectful to each other.
Right.
And we're not in a position of abuse, one or the other.
Right.
And and where we're sticking the landing on this is definitely not there. No. And the novel is endorsing it. And we're sort of being trained and manipulated to go, oh, what a good ending. Oh, they ended up together. And I'm like, she ended up with her ring. You know, oh no, with her abuser. in a society that has abused her from start to finish. You know, no.
Yeah. And like, I know that there are some people who are like, oh, but she doesn't ultimately end up with Tamlin. She eventually ends up
with... I don't think we can... I don't know if there's much of a defense there.
I have heard people say that, though. It's fine. It's fine that she did, because she doesn't end up with Tamlin.
No, she ends up with the guy who roofies her.
Yeah.
What? That's better?
I would just like to go back to the scene where Bryson heals her, because
he's willing to walk away. He's about to walk away and let her die on the floor.
Well, not just that. When he heals her, he purposefully does it in a way that will harm her.
Right.
He forces her to have pain before healing her.
Right.
This is the guy that she ultimately...
Right. I forgot about that, where he's like pushing on her arm when it's broken or whatever.
Yeah, he's physically causing her pain because he can, and he's going to be her ultimate true love. And again,
consent. Not only is it that she's going to die if she doesn't do it, he's actively hurting her more and torturing her to get her to say yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we get the tattoo and the psychic connection and blah, blah, blah. Gross! I forgot about that part. God, there's so much BS in this book.
Again, like, to the people who are like, it's okay because she doesn't ultimately end up with Tamlin, she ends up with Rysand. That's who Rysand is, okay? That was, we introduce him like that, you know?
Yeah, it's wild, man. It's
upsetting.
It's very upsetting. And it's, you know, and as we said at the beginning, it's indefensible. This book is indefensible. And like, and so I know I'm kind of asking what I would consider an impossible question. You know, when I'm asking the readers who are out there who enjoyed this work, like, why? How? You know, and I think the only answer is, oh, well, I wasn't paying attention.
Yeah.
That's the only thing, is I was going along with the emotions, and I was taking the book on its own terms.
Right.
Which is framing all of this as sexy.
Yeah.
And so I chose to just agree with it, you know, kind of unconsciously as I was reading. And to that I would say, you know, again, And there are people who I think are kind of constantly saying, like, oh, well, I should have the right to just enjoy what I enjoy, to consume what I want to consume thoughtlessly. And I would say there are some books that you can do that, but some have a higher cost.
Yeah.
And this is the sort of book that has a very high cost, both in our culture and possibly for you personally, if you're just kind of imbibing it without thinking about it.
Right. Well, and like, I just to reiterate, like we have this concept that we can turn our brains off when we read things and we're not taking in the stuff. That's not true. Your brain is never off. Your brain is never not like taking in what you're putting into it.
You're being influenced. As we know from influencers and marketing and all of this, like this is propaganda. That's like, why I like frame it that way.
Right. So there is never actually a point where you can say, oh, I read it with my brain off. No, your brain took everything in, but because you're not being thoughtful about it, you're just agreeing with the narrative, and the narrative is telling you it's okay to harm you. Yeah. Like that's the long and the short of it.
Yeah, I agree. And we just want to say it's not.
It's not. You
You
deserve better.
Yeah. You deserve better writing, and you deserve better morals in your works.
And it's totally okay to be like, you know what? I don't want to be treated like that, so this book is not bad. This book is bad. Like it's okay to say like the book told me that it was okay, but actually it's not okay.
Yeah. Yeah, to disagree with the narrative framing. So, where do we want to land the podcast here? I feel like we've pretty much said
we've covered everything. I hope. I know that this book has like the kind of like
I found the sneeze, guys. So sorry.
It finally came.
Like I was sitting here like making this face for about 60 seconds while you were talking.
I do like feel a little bit like weird about going into this space because the readership of this series is so intense about like I like it, so you can't say it's bad.
And I feel like one, it's a big fan base. It's a fan base who really loves the books, and it's a fan base that has been criticized before.
Yeah.
And again, I kind of want to emphasize, like, I'm not criticizing you. I'd like to invite you to a more thoughtful way of reading books, because I think it'll be ultimately for your benefit, and because I care about you and I think you deserve better. Which I feel like sounds so condescending, and I don't mean it that way. What I am criticizing is the words on the page, and I am criticizing Sarah J. Maas for not taking responsibility for what her book means.
Yeah, A Court of Thorns and Roses has a worldview.
Yeah,
like it's not just a turn your brain off fantasy. Yeah, it has a worldview. It has messages that are in it repeatedly over and over. They are not subtle. They are screamed at you. Like this book is not just a cute little romantasy. Like this book is saying something, and like. We need to. All I'm asking is like we stop pretending it's not saying something.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to say it, because I do feel like sometimes I'm feeling like maybe I'm engaging in somewhat of a disingenuous conversation. I don't think people mean it that way, but it's almost like, well, I probably shouldn't bring this up. It's super controversial, but like we had Elon Musk on the stage of the inauguration. And then I feel like I'm having a conversation with people who are like, oh, that doesn't mean what it means.
It means what it means no matter what you call it.
Right. And I feel like this is kind of a similar situation. Obviously different and not as whatever. I'm not saying that they're tantamount or equal to each other, but they're similar in that I'm like, well, this book is real clear about what it thinks, and we're pretending like it doesn't mean something.
Right, exactly. We're pretending like it's just a cute story. Right. And it's like, I would hazard to say there's almost like no story out there that doesn't have at least some thoughts behind it and like some messaging, but this one is screaming its messaging. This is not subtle. This is not subtext. Yeah. Like it has a worldview, it has a message, and like we need to just admit that at least. Yeah. At least admit that this book has a worldview, and like we're not going to pretend anymore that it's just a cute little romantasy.
Yeah, I agree. So with all of that and all of those big feelings coming from us, we do invite conversation in the comments below.
We do.
We are happy to hear other people's perspectives. If there's things that you think that we missed, obviously we didn't cover everything here in terms of the flaws of the book. I think it extends.
A 16-hour long book. Yeah. Like, there's only so much you can say in this time frame.
Yeah, I think it extends beyond what we did. Obviously, our focus was on the female issues that we see in this book. It's something I'm very passionate about. It's something that I care a lot about. I care about the influence that these types of things have on our culture, because I do think that they're for the worse and not for the better.
Agreed. Yeah. Like I don't, as someone who's seen a number of women fall prey to situations that we're talking about in this book. Like, I care deeply about talking about this because, like, I think that if you're turning your back on like what a lot of women experience and just saying like, no, I like this book, like you are turning your back on a lot of women who have suffered through a lot.
At the very least, it anesthetizes you to the cruelty that's here.
Right, exactly.
And I would say at the end of the day, the book is extremely manipulative and it's extremely cruel. And I want to be the sort of person who's sensitive to that. And I would invite you to also be that sort of person.
Agreed.
And that's what we have for you today. Thank you, everybody.
That is our thoughts on Acotar.
Here come the comments. Oh, God. All right. Okay, we'll talk to you guys next month. Oh, my God.
I'm going to go get another cup of tea.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right,
bye.